If you're a parent of an adult child, worried and frustrated because they are struggling to become independent, responsible, and find purpose in their life, or you want to know what to do to prevent it, you're in the right place. This is Launch, a podcast that helps you guide your adult child to launch confidently into adulthood. I'm Shari Jonas, author, educator, and co-parenting consultant, taking a deep dive into the ongoing challenges that you're faced with as you watch your adult child struggle. Each episode will deliver actionable steps and strategies that you can take to help your young adult become confident, motivated, and self-sufficient. Parents, if you want your adult child to achieve a life of independence, thrive in this world, and reach their full potential, then listen in to Launch.
I think the biggest misconception about neurodivergent kids and young adults and adults is that it's something you grow out of. It's not. And I really want that to sit there for a minute. It isn't. It is a different brain. You can learn a lot of skills. You can develop a lot of strategies. But at the end of the day, it's a different way that your brain operates. And so for parents, to have a lot of compassion that there will be peaks and valleys in a neurodivergent person's capacity, and that is absolutely okay.
I'm Shari Jonas, and this is Launch. My guest today is Anita Allen. We were first introduced because of our shared interest in parents of young adults who are launching into adulthood. Our first conversation was on Zoom, and after an hour, we decided that because we live so close to each other, which we didn't know ahead of time, that we had to meet again in person and continue chatting over coffee. Talking with Anita was incredibly eye-opening, and I know her story will really speak to you. I don't want to give too much away, but I'll tell you this. Anita is neurotypical, but the rest of her family is not. So, Anita leaned into her background as a physiotherapist, and through the lens of their nervous system, she began a deep dive exploring everything she needed to know about her children. On top of being a very busy mom, Anita is also a parenting coach and a talented writer who shares her years of experience on topics like neurodiversity, mental health, generational trauma, and what it takes to break those family cycles. Her Substack newsletter, Horse Among Zebras, offers insights and support for parents and caregivers who are raising neurodivergent kids. After hearing Anita's story, you'll understand exactly why I am so excited to have her on the podcast. So let's get into it. Anita, I really appreciate you joining me today. I just want to get right into your story for our listener.
Awesome.
Can you take us back to the beginning? What was it like becoming a mom for the very first time, specifically when your first son when his diagnosis was unfolding, and how that experience shaped your journey, especially as your family grew? Take me back to the beginning.
So Liam was my firstborn, and he was a quirky kid. He was a little bit different, very, very verbal, very engaging, really, really smart, but had some challenges, So thinking backwards now, I realized that, transitions were a little tough for him. Changes to his routine were tough. And although he was sensitive, he'd often just miss other people's emotions. So by the time he was 10, there's a 6-year age gap between Liam and his next sibling, and then which is Sam. And then Jack was born very shortly after Sam. So all of a sudden at age 10, he's got, toddler brothers. And that was a huge disruption. And then we moved to a bigger house in a new neighborhood. So when Liam got to school, he, so many foundations of his life had changed. And suddenly we started to see big behavior. And at school, it was really a challenge. It was a challenge at home as well. And one day I just thought, I need help. I don't understand what's going on. So we went to see a psychologist. And at that time, I thought, maybe he just doesn't understand emotions, doesn't understand his emotions, doesn't understand other people's emotions. So I went in saying to the psychologist, I think he might be, and I said, I don't think this is a clinical term. I think he might be emotionally illiterate, and I don't know how to help him as a parent. And that started a process of getting an identification as being on the autism spectrum. At his age and at that time, it would have been Asperger's syndrome. But eventually that got sort of included into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella. So, yeah, after that, the psychologist said, this kind of issue runs in families. Is it possible, that your other kids are experiencing some difficulties? And so she suggested that we start them, they were toddlers at the time, that we start them in a preschool program just to see how they socialize and how they did with other kiddos. And yeah, there were problems. And so fairly quickly, I would say within 18 months, we were told that all three of our children were on the autism spectrum. Later on, ADHD was added to their diagnoses. And then a few other, they each have their own flavor. So each kid has their own unique additional diagnoses. So they're all neurocomplex people. And that's what we found out. And once we found that out, I started to realize that, holy cow, it is in the family. It's actually multi-generational. And that was a big shift.
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, multi-generational, because it's so heritable. And I just heard this from a psychiatrist yesterday, that the heritability or the likelihood of you inheriting ADHD is about on par with height, how you would inherit height from a parent. I had
Okay.
no idea that it was that strong of a genetic connection. So that was really amazing. I just know that now. But looking back, I could see a lot of my kids' behaviors were echoes of my father's, my brother's, even some of my sister's early life, where it was hard for her to regulate her emotions. I could see that there was like this string of behaviors running through the family, even when we weren't always spending a lot of time together. So it's not like my kids were strongly influenced by watching and mimicking. They were actually doing this kind of independent. And so it was really shocking to me when I started to see some of these same threads, and
Right.
ultimately really freeing, because once I understood my kids better, I understood my family better, and our family dynamics really improved after that. There are some behaviors that are common in our family system that maybe wouldn't exist in a family that's not neurodivergent.
Can you give me an example?
I think difficulties with transitions at different points, maybe like executive functions, I think are the ones that show up the most. So, memory, organization, and planning sometimes. I think it's an interesting situation for a nervous system, because I'll give you this as an example for my kids, because it was more present for me as a parent. But, they can look really, really altogether fine, and we'll be doing something, or they'll be in a situation like, say, summer camp, and I will watch them, they're doing fine. And then all of a sudden, there's a skill gap. And that skill gap just feels like a giant pothole that you just fell into.
Mm.
And from the outside, you just think, wow, that's a really shocking, surprising behavior. But once you understand that a spectrum is a behavior, like it gaps, strengths and challenges, and that it's really uneven. So a great, from adult life, I'm thinking about my husband, and he would always forget to tell me about conversations that he had with his mom or his sister that involved some planning. And then he would be really surprised that I didn't know, like, to mark that date on the calendar, or I wouldn't know that it was a surprise party. Because I think, again, with his working memory, the way it is, that he would just forget that one detail. And then it would be like this pothole that we'd hit. And I'd be like, you didn't tell me that. I mean, that some people will say that's just what a marriage is, right? It's just not not always
Sounds normal to me.
yeah, not always communicating all the details. I mean, they're just subtle things, really. But when I look at them through the lens of like neurodiversity, I start to think about, well, maybe it's more than just forgetfulness, that maybe he's working really hard to remember all the other details, but this detail has been missed. Just
Right.
like with my kids in camp, they're working really hard to be social and follow the rules. But then when a skill pops up that they don't have, it just shocks everybody, the way how quickly a situation deteriorates.
So a skill that you would think they would have because
Right.
they're amongst other children that are demonstrating that skill, but for some reason they don't have it.
Yes, or they appear to have most of the skill, but there's one spot, or that they just tip over. It's like that Pepsi bottle analogy where you shake it, you shake it, you shake it until, okay, now we're at the end of the capacity and this explosion happens that nobody saw coming. So that would happen a lot with kids where at camp and in daycare where things would seem to be fine and people would sort of say, "Oh, I think you're exaggerating their needs." But then once the explosive behavior occurred, I would have to say, well, it was actually building.
Mm.
And now we've hit this place and it's hard because they have a gap in their self-regulation. What would have been a minor annoyance has now become a full-blown meltdown that nobody thought because they looked competent up until that moment.
I really appreciate you sharing so openly about your family. I know it's not always easy to talk about our children and the things that are not, sitting right. It's very hard for parents. I know over the years, I've seen a lot of parents who struggle with being more open. And I'm sure it's because they're afraid of being judged. So I really do appreciate how candid you've been with me so far. I really do wish more parents would feel more comfortable talking about their experiences. I think that it would make such a difference to know that not all children follow this typical path. And if we could just normalize the truth that all kids come into the world with their own unique set of traits. In fact, because of our conversations, last week I wrote an episode, and it's a wake up call to parents that it really does more harm than good to compare our children to everyone else's. And we do it from the beginning, like, oh, my kids on like they're the biggest, they're the best, they're the fastest, they're growing. So I've grown up with that. Like I've seen it all around me, and I've often wondered, why are you doing that? What good is that? The shit hasn't even hit the fan yet, and here you are bragging about your kids. So I wish we would embrace our children for their individual qualities rather than trying to always compare them to, everybody else. So before we go any further, though, for the listener, I think we have to explain a little bit more about what neurodivergence is. And you've got a great handle on it. So, can you define neurodiversity and explain it as in terms of the difference between a neurotypical brain? You sort of touched on executive functioning, but I want you to kind of get into that a little bit more since your sons, all three of them, have experienced different variations of that. So please go ahead and share what neurodivergence is.
Yeah, well, humans, we have so much diversity, in our nervous systems. And that's what makes us unique. And sort of everybody's different. And we need to, embrace that we're not a homogenous society. But neurodivergence is a little bit different. And what I love to compare it to is the difference between having an iPhone and an Android phone. Same device, does most of the same things, but they have very different operating systems. You
I
know,
love that. That's a fantastic analogy.
yeah, because there used to be an analogy for those of us who are older between PC and Mac, but kids don't appreciate that quite as much as maybe our generation did. But Android and iPhone, just really different ways of processing data and giving you the output that you're looking for. And so neurodivergent brains, and this covers a lot of disorders, like it could be ADHD or executive functioning issues. And even disorder, I want to back away from because it's really not pathological. It's actually just a different expression of our humanity. It doesn't match up to the neurotypical experience, but statistics tell us that 1 in 32 kids are on the autism spectrum. And that's a lot. So that's one per classroom, at least, right? One per hockey team, probably, so very high incidence. It's probably higher for other spectrum disorders it's not a spectrum disorder, but ADHD, which is a neurodivergence, I should say. What else? OCD, a lot of even dyslexia, they all fall under an umbrella of a brain that's processing information differently than the majority. And the issue is, I think we apply the benchmarks of the majority all the time. And so
Right.
it seems like these folks are somehow dysfunctional. They're not, they're just functioning differently. And we need to make allowances for that.
Okay. What's one thing that's different amongst all three of them, if you can?
Yeah, probably in the realm of executive function. So, executive function, just to back that up, what it is like things like planning, processing information, impulsivity, motivation, a lot of those things, because that's where the differences are in my kiddos. My oldest son, who is in his mid 20s and he's launching, he's out there in the world. Has high intelligence and high motivation. And so he leans really hard into his strengths, and that helps him overcome a lot of his challenges. My middle son, who's 17 and in his teens, his brain really, from an executive function point of view, like he doesn't produce a lot of dopamine. So he looks really unmotivated a lot of the time. That's probably the biggest misconception about him. It just takes him, because his brain doesn't produce that chemical, it takes him so much more effort to do things and start things and see them through. And so, a lot of times in school, for example, he's been labeled as lazy, or people have thought he's just not interested. That's not true. It's so much effort for him to get up to the threshold for action that sometimes, he runs out of steam really quickly. And then my youngest, I love to call him the nutty professor. He's that ADHD drive he's so interested in different things. But when he picks an interest, he's just all in, and very hyper focused. And that works for him sometimes if it's aligned with something he's trying to do. Sometimes it can work against him. And I would say from an executive function point of view, he's a bit more impulsive than his brothers. He's more likely to, want to just do things on the spot without having thought it through. So again, same on paper, same identifications, but when you go deeper into their testing and their profiles and in just watching them in real life, they're very, very different people, and they all need to be parented differently, which is tough.
When we talk about adults, young adults becoming independent, we often think of milestones like starting a career, managing money, moving out. But for neurodivergent kids, the timeline can look very different. Can you talk about how your eldest son has navigated that transition? Because you mentioned he's launched, which I love. So how did he make that transition into adulthood, both in terms of his executive functioning skills, and I think we touched on this emotionally when comparing himself to neurotypical kids who are like peers or even family members. So let's talk about how, because I think that's incredible, by the way. So I'm so glad for you that you kept moving him along. But let's talk about him because he's launched. So tell me what that's like.
Yeah. Yeah, he's launched. He's got a lot of internal drive, and he's very good. I think this is the interesting mashup of his, neurological profile, is that he's really determined, so he's got that sort of inflexibility about his goals, even if sometimes the pathway appears kind of winding, but he knows where he's going. Yeah, he has a social life. It took him many years. It was tough being different. It's not easy in school and in high school. So college is where he really took flight. And I think the fact that he was suddenly with people who were interested in the same things he was interested in, he found his tribe, which was really great. And he had been slowly building, I think, another tribe, which are people who sort of embraced the quirks that he also was experiencing. So this is where, like, I know social media is full of perils, but at the same time, it also allowed him to connect with people that were like him, that had the same sense of humor, that had the same, interest in topics. So he sort of built himself this social world. Unfortunately, when he went to college, it was during COVID. So he never got to have that experience of moving out and living in residence. He was still at home, like so many, young adults at that time. But he built good friendships with his classmates. So they still have reunions, they still get together. I'm thinking about his career. He works really hard. He's got an incredible work ethic. And I think, though, where things get a little challenging for him is juggling all of it all at the same time. So he's got a great work ethic. He's got a good social life that he's created. It does make it difficult for him to do things like, stay on top of laundry, keep his room clean, like just little things. And it's not that he doesn't do them. I just know that it costs him a whole lot more energy and effort than it does for someone else. So he manages it, but sometimes, if he's worked a lot of hours or something like that, in order for him not to get depleted and burned out, that's where I might sort of offer him some support. It's like, let's tackle this together, because I know his motivation for that is low. I know he's spent all his energy currency on other places that are really important. I just don't want him to burn out. He's very successful at other things.
Okay, just for clarity purposes, is he living at home?
He's currently living at home, saving.
Okay.
He's almost saved. He's got his own car that he's paid for. He's living at home. He's saving up his down payment for a townhome. And yeah.
That's incredible considering where we live.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
really expensive.
Yeah, he has a financial plan. He has investments as well. So he's really great with money. That's another strength he has. Yeah.
So for the parent who's wondering, and I know that we're going to talk about like how you're amazing and you offer your services to help parents in the same situation because you've done so much work with it that now you're able to help other parents. Let's say I want to know, how would I get my young adult to start socializing? He seems to have nailed that. And I'm wondering, and so he used social media, or did he meet people in person? What would you suggest to a parent who's wants to figure out how to help their son become more, or their child become more social?
That's so tricky, and it wasn't easy for him in the beginning. A lot of credit goes to my oldest son, like goes to Liam for this. But for him, I think his interests were really very specific. It was hard to find other young adults that had that level of knowledge and interest. So it was frustrating for him. And then I think, his expectations of other people his age were really high, and then people were not meeting them. So that's kind of a typical Aspergian autistic thing. But I find that with my younger two as well, that again, their interests are really narrow and focused. And so a passing conversation just doesn't scratch the itch for them. And they're still working on having enough social flexibility to tolerate somebody else's interest and show appropriate interest in that other person. So it's a bit of a monologue, an information dump, one track interest. I've found though, and I'm less panicked about my younger two than I was for Liam, that they're good at finding their tribes as they get older. They start to connect with other people who have that same kind of passion. So my youngest one, for example, is just all in on Pokemon.
I'm smiling because I wanted you to say that story. I love that he found his tribe. So please share that one.
Yeah. So he has always been interested in Pokemon. We were a little careful with him because of his impulse control and things like that can be a challenge for him. But with some guardrails, we sort of let him buy cards, let him start to interact online a little bit with it. And now he's actually found in-person trading opportunities, these little clubs that operate where they sell and trade cards. They grade them. And he hangs out. It's like, I joke, it's like our rep hockey, in our house, because he's out 3 or 4 nights a week, playing games, meeting other people at trading, and just chatting and really, filling his cup socially around this special interest.
And how did he find them?
over time. How did he find the live clips?
Yeah, like I want to
Yeah.
know how. And you know what? It's funny because I'm not going to keep comparing your kids to neurotypical kids, but this is a problem for
Mhm.
a lot of young adults and kids. How do they make their friends? It can't always be in school. Sometimes it has to be outside of school. So I'm asking you this question for your kids, but I think it's a question that every parent wants to know. I hear it all the time. How do children meet other children that are like-minded?
It's definitely for them online communities. When they were old enough to access some of them, it was helpful. And it's scary, right? Also to have, so it's like finding that balance between what they're connecting to online, what their special interests are, and helping, just helping them navigate. So it felt risky for us at times, but it has allowed him to, we had to step back and trust his discernment to a certain level, and then check in with them, like, are these good places? And then when my husband took him to his first meetup, like, my husband kind of lingered around on the
Mm.
periphery, to see what it was like.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened for Jack. That's my youngest. For my oldest, he was on a lot of forums talking about very specific car things, but he was younger than most of the people in those forums. So that was, again, my husband joined some of them so he could monitor. Eventually, my son was so into racing and cars, my oldest, that he ended up doing simulated racing, which is an
Mm.
online racing. And he was able to race and compete with some of the Porsche drivers who were the driving instructors. So again, like, he was 15, 16, doing these races and placing fairly well in them against adults. And so that gave him, I think, a lot of confidence. He went on
Mhm.
to work for Porsche for a while. He volunteers with Porsche Club of Canada, or he used to. He's too busy now. But so again, letting him follow those interests. He also had a fascination with big trucks when he was little. So again, my husband, arranged to register them as a kind of company, so that they could go to truck shows that were industry events, and he could check out all the regs, and it just fed his interest. They're offbeat,
I
these
love it.
interests, but
I love
they're
that.
but there's so the passion runs so deep. And I think that's allowed them, again, Liam now works in trucking, and it is because of his early interest.
I love
And
it.
yeah.
So with neurotypical kids, we use the term failure to launch when they're struggling to gain independence. But neurodivergent kids, they're not failing. They're just on a different path. And again, in one of our recent conversations, you used the term slower to launch. Can you explain what that means and why it's so important for parents to shift their mindset? And again, we're going back to stop comparing their neurodivergent child to others and instead start focusing on what's developmentally right for your child. So let's talk a little bit about slower to launch. I think it's so important.
I think the biggest misconception about neurodivergent kids and young adults and adults is that it's something you grow out of. It's not. And I really want that to sit there for a minute. It isn't. It is a different brain. You can learn a lot of skills, you can develop a lot of strategies, but at the end of the day, it's a different way that your brain operates. And so for parents, to have a lot of compassion that there will be peaks and valleys in a neurodivergent person's capacity, and that is absolutely okay, and that it is actually completely how it is. I think people get impatient with their teenagers, thinking, oh, I can't believe we're still struggling with this. I wish they'd grow up. They should be more mature. But they're doing the best they can with the way that their nervous system works. And I think that's really important. So slower to launch for me means, and get a good sense of the individual in front of you and where their strengths are. And then, leverage those strengths to be able to become more independent. I think the other thing that parents often overlook for slower to launch young adults is that learning doesn't always generalize. So if you teach one skill and you expect in each situation for them to be able to repeat that skill, that's not how a neurodivergent brain always works. So doing laundry at home, for example, they might be completely independent doing laundry at home. Doing laundry in residence is a whole new skill set. So the situation is different and the skill needs to be kind of relearned or tweaked in the new setting. Yeah, so
Got
that's
it.
really important because you can look at them and make a snap judgment that they're failing somehow, when really it's just about how they learn situationally, not taking something and broadly applying it. And this is
Got
not
it.
every single kid, but it's
Mhm.
many.
So it's years ago, I heard this expression, it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Right.
And that's, I think, again, how you have to treat your children. But again, I think we all have to treat even ourselves that way. Give ourselves and our children, which regardless of their type of brain, just that grace. There's no finish, like there's no finish line. It's just the process, right? And your process, their process is different, but it's not bad or good. It's
Yeah.
just different.
Grace is such a good word, Sherry, because we need to be compassionate with them. We need to be compassionate with ourselves. And I think it's important also to always, assume some competency, assume that your neurodivergent child is trying and wants to do well,
Mm-hmm.
and then be prepared to let them fail once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like you have to rescue them from the failure, but support them when they do so that they learn, you learn. But that takes an enormous amount of grace to know that something's going to go wrong, but to just kind of sit back and be ready to catch them and be the soft place to land.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of self-compassion and a lot of grace.
Yeah. Which is actually my next thing I wanted to say to you is that we've touched on the timelines and how they look different for neurodivergent kids, but I want to pause for a second and ask you to share what this feels like for you
Mhm.
as a parent. We talk about, you just mentioned with grace to the children, but what about grace for yourself? Compassion for yourself. And, you know, if you can, just tell me when your child is not hitting the typical milestones and other parents are stepping back, but you're still so heavily involved. How does that feel for you? Like, talk about those emotions, the guilt, the frustration, even that sense of isolation as a parent. Tell me how Anita's doing.
Oh,
Or
yeah, I'm doing better having had one run at this with my oldest son. I'm and more maturity now when I'm parenting my younger two. It's getting easier. There's a lot of judgment when you're raising kids that are responding to the world differently. And it is isolating. It is a bit lonely because other, children are or even young adults are doing different things and mine will do them, but do them in a different timeline and probably do them on a timeline different from their brothers even.
mm,
So it can be isolating. You can feel judged a lot for stepping in to do things. It's easy to hear over coffee with friends like, oh, I won't do their laundry, or I charge them X number of dollars to be their laundry service. And that parenting style doesn't work in my house, so I am often going in the opposite direction of my peers, with lower demands in certain things. But it's tailored to my kids. I feel better now marching to the beat of our own drummer, but it took a while to get to that because I did, especially with my oldest son. I tried all the things that other parents and that a lot of parent experts were recommending. They were backfiring, and I just felt like I was just so unsuccessful as a mother. But when I switched to parenting the child who was in front of me, the individual, even if it went against everything, that experts were saying, that worked. So we started to lean into what worked. And I think my confidence has grown considerably over that time because the house is way calmer. The kids are way happier, which allows me to feel much happier. I think the other thing it was that's helped my self-compassion grow is to let go of my rigid expectations. I was a type A, really loved school, really emphasized academics a lot. That's not my kids. That's not who they are. And so just being able to be a little looser with my expectations, to be, you know, really thinking about the big picture. And does it matter that all the laundry is in a jumbled basket on the floor? If I were doing it, it would be folded and put away right away. But like this is typical or neurodivergent kids. Just lowering the bar. It's like, okay, your laundry's done. You have clean clothes for work. Is it folded and put away? No, but that's okay. That's not, that might come later, and it may not come at all.
Right.
And that's okay. I'm not a failure as a mother because my kid didn't fold their underwear and put it away in the right drawer,
Amen to that.
Right?
Right.
Right.
So what did you do for support now that you are so much like ahead of the game here? I feel like, and that's why you're doing what you're doing. But who was there for you?
Early days, not too many people. And yeah, I just want to emphasize, I'm just, for a lot of parents, I'm no special expert, but I have lived this intensely. And then I also have my experience as a physiotherapist, which has really helped me break down steps and break down goals and assess therapies and things like that. So that's been helpful. But when my oldest son was diagnosed, all I was getting was, a few minutes at the end of his appointments. And usually it wasn't for me to process anything. It was for me to be given a list of more jobs that we needed to do after we left therapy. So it was exhausting, because I was parenting at 110% and then also kind of doing all the therapy and work behind the scenes. And I didn't have anybody. I didn't know anybody who was living my experience. I didn't have time to find people who were living it because all I could do is just get through the days.
Right.
But over time, as my kids got a little bit older, I started to get to realize that this is a marathon. It wasn't going to be a sprint whereby, such and such a date they would be, fixed. This was our lifelong commitment to each other, me and my kids. And so I started to reach out for some more support. A lot of the behaviors that we were encountering were very triggering, because sometimes it can come off as very aggressive. Also, the adults in systems don't always understand your children. So it's really hard to listen to, for example, school expectations and interpretations of things without feeling kind of personally attacked. So I needed to do a lot of work with therapists on my hot buttons so that I could show up then for my kids in a calm and regulated way. And then, when a situation was over, I could go and unpack that with a therapist and work it through. So I was kind of, doing therapy in real time, in and out. Reading really helped me. Reading thoughts of people who actually have ADHD, executive functioning issues, autistics. So reading memoirs. Social media has been wonderful as well as a support. I've joined a few groups and just saying, I'm a mom of 3, I'm an ally, but I'm here to understand, older people talking about what's going on. That's been huge in terms of help and support. It helps me ask my kids the right questions because.
I'm sorry, when you say older people, do you mean older people with neurodivergent?
Yes,
Okay.
I should clarify that. Yeah. So some of the, especially late diagnosed folks who are unpacking, oh, when I was a kid, I wish I had known, or this is what medication has been like for me. Those are really helpful insights to have because my kids, when they're living it, they're not always able to articulate it. And it also validates me to a certain extent to go, I'm on the right track with that. So I think listening to actually neurodivergent folks discuss their lived experience has been a huge support to me as I try to support my kids.
Yeah, no, I think that's an amazing idea to go ahead and say, okay, so I'm dealing with this right now, but what can I expect in the future? Because I was going to touch on managing your expectations over the years, but instead of it's such a black box, if you will, of you're in unknown territory. So the best thing you can do is like what you did and go ahead and meet older people and say like, where are you now?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they didn't even have the support that they had as that you're providing your young adult. So I think that's great. And so you found that that's really helped you in terms of expectations. It's like what
Absolutely.
you can look forward to almost.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or at least it helps me ask better questions, I think, like about how my kids are experiencing things. Because it's everybody's lens and history is different, but it just it helps refine, I guess, so it isn't such a black box. I'm now just trying to explore, a few symptoms or one particular life issue, and I've gathered three or four perspectives, and now I can kind of ask good questions about it. You asked about expectations. And I think that's a really interesting one because we can get really locked into just having the same expectations all the time of our kids, like not adjusting our expectations as our kids grow up. Like I see that often in other parents and the frustration. And I've been guilty of it as well, thinking, oh, they're never going to do X, Y, or Z.
Tell us about your expectations and how you've had to modify them, if you can.
The expectation for independence has been a slow build. I'm really careful not to lock us into, you must be able to do the five things, by a certain age. I think what's happened with expectations is I kind of tossed them out the window and just focused on little micro steps. So, are you able to gather your laundry and get it all into the basket, on laundry day, for example? Are you able to get it from there to in front of the washing machine? All right, we're moving forward. Are you able to now get it into the machine? Because that's how small sometimes the steps need to be, until you get to, for someone else, you might be able to say, grab your clothes and put them in the washing machine. But for a neurodivergent kid with executive function issues, like that's a big ask. There's many, many small steps in there. So being able to just lower your expectation to those micro steps, it's like, okay, we're moving forward now. I had my kids even get to the point where they put the soap in, they put the clothes in, and I'll say, did you hit start? And they'll go, oh, no. So it's like, it is, the expectation is like, okay, we got there. It took us 10 steps and that's okay. Where I think in earlier days, I would have just thought that was just one goal, get your laundry into the machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually many small wins before you
Got it.
get there.
Got it.
So that's how it's changed. And I think that lets us build on success, and it takes the pressure off of me. I'm not thinking way, way out there, like, oh my gosh, they'll never know how to cook a meal. They'll never know, it's just breaking it down a little to smaller, can you scramble an egg? Okay, well, if you have to make a meal, then you can scramble an egg.
Right.
Even just things as simple as the appliances we choose for them. Like we have an air fryer that automatically turns off after a certain amount of time. So, the whole kitchen, they're not using the stove and the stovetop, like it's safe and they can be independent.
Got it.
Another game saver was a panini press. There's a lot of things you can make in a panini press. Um, and again, it's independent, it's safe. And if they forget and leave the stove on, like it's not an issue now, because the machine will turn itself off. So I
Got
think
it.
setting people up for success too, just in the everyday environment, also has helped us kind of build those small steps towards independence. Like Liam's much more competent in the kitchen, obviously at his age and stage. He's, what's age appropriate for him, like even things like, getting his paycheck into the deposited, paying his car insurance, just those basic life skills, like he can grocery shop now. And I don't want to make it sound like every kid is capable of that. You just have to really look at what your child is able to do, right? Because there are some children on the spectrum for whom independence might just look like being able to use a communication board to say, I need to use the washroom. And I feel like that population sometimes feels like, oh, independence, it's nice to talk about independence when your kids are doing well, but independence for kids who are facing big challenges looks different too, right? It's being able to communicate basic needs. It's being able to express a feeling or an emotion or a discomfort. So independence looks just so different depending on what your capacities are, what your strengths are.
One of the biggest challenges that parents face, especially when their adult child is still living at home, is figuring out where to draw the line between helping and over helping. So we're touching on all of this, but I guess where I'm going is setting boundaries. So talk about how you have approached that boundary setting part of raising a young adult. What kinds of boundaries have made the biggest difference in your family? And how do you maintain them while still being supportive? Because it's like, you know, set the boundaries, step back, set the boundaries, but watch over them. So how would you talk about boundaries in your family?
Yeah, boundaries is an interesting one. And again, they're different to each individual. But I would say the common ones we have are that you show up with respect for other people. And that's and sometimes that boundary gets crossed because of emotional dysregulation, because of a host of things. A lot of my kids, their profiles or their phenotype in autism means that they don't always respect hierarchies in social settings. So they don't look at people and go, oh, you have authority. They feel that everything's sort of level.
Wasn't it your little one?
Yes.
Tell that story.
Oh, yeah. He's so great. So he really didn't, he was in kindergarten and he absolutely had no idea about social hierarchy in school. And so he just referred to all his teachers by their last names and would walk in the morning very sunny and look at the principal and go, hey, Gilman. And hey, McDonald, and just high five them and keep on going. So he had no idea that they weren't his peer group. So that's kind of tough, right? And it gets them into other troubles when they get older. But I tried to instill in them early that we just respect everybody, because trying to teach them about social hierarchies, like, they're complicated. That's a real invisible social skill. So just saying, you just presume that everybody deserves your respect. So that was one boundary. And yes, they've crossed it a few times, and I've had to show up in awkward meetings and be supportive. But each time, we learn from it. And now my expectation of them, is age appropriate. Don't, I don't know, I can't think of it, like, listen to your teacher. Or if you're having a hard time, now they have the capacity to say, look, I'm having a really hard time. I need to walk away from this situation. And they can say it in a respectful way. Even just teaching them that, to say, I'm walking away from the classroom, but I'm going to the office, or I'm going to student support, so that the adults all understood, that they weren't just taking off randomly. So that's a boundary around respect.
So I can imagine that parenting a neurodivergent child can be all consuming. It sounds like it is. And sometimes, even without realizing it, your identity starts to revolve around being needed. So let's talk about that risk of codependency. How does it become even more complicated, especially if there's addiction or self medicating behaviors in the picture? So I think that's a topic I want to see if we can kind of unpack for a minute.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. I think it begins with just being really honest with ourselves about evaluating what our kids actually need. So updating ourselves about what skills they actually have. And that might mean letting them fail at a few things so that you can get a decent benchmark of where they are. Because if without that sort of opportunity to test their limits from time to time in a safe and supported way, your expectations or your beliefs about your child don't grow with them. And I think then what also happens is confidence gets eroded. And so on the child or young adult side, that idea of learned helplessness, of why bother,
Mm.
really can get ingrained. And then once you get to people sort of in that complex dance, and trust me, you do, parenting is intense, and you're often there in ways that you don't expect to be. And you're advocating a lot. So it's easy to start to feel like that you must advocate their entire lives. But I would encourage parents to just step back and evaluate, is this actually true? And what can I hand off? And what can I outsource to a coach or someone else to keep yourselves intact as individuals and moving forward? I think the other thing that happens is that when we're not honest about what's going on and not checking in some way, that difficult behaviors, self-soothing behaviors start to occur, maybe in both parties. But for the young adult, for example, that's gaming excessively or spending a lot of time, screen addicted, or is self-medicating, with weed or alcohol, or is living dangerously and, with a lot of promiscuity because of impulse control. We have to be really honest about that and not be ashamed about it, because then if we're ashamed about it and somehow trying to micromanage it, it just feeds itself. It's very unhealthy, I think, for both parties. So I think it's important to just be honest and seek help. It's a complicated dynamic. It started out in a useful, helpful way. Like when we're parenting neurodivergent kids, a lot of times we're subbing in our prefrontal cortex, which is where all the executive functions live around planning and emotional regulation and impulse control. Parents are providing that service. I think there's a tipping point there, because I think you really do have to assist their brain with your brain. So there is an intermingling. The tricky part is when that becomes so habitual that you stop seeing the growth, that you just fall into the rut of that. And that's where I think it gets really tricky. And that's why I think professional support's really important, because burnout happens for parents a lot. Burnout happens for neurodivergent people a lot because of that emotional overload. People are emotionally invested, but the system, the family system, the education system, whatever system, the work system, it's not working for them anymore. And their nervous system just collapses in the face of that. And if you have a young adult who's kind of in a burnout or who's got learned helplessness and is starting to have addictive self-soothing behaviors that aren't healthy, parental well-being goes down too. And now nobody's able to help each other. And if you're locked into that because of a cycle of shame or a belief that you should have done better, it just reinforces the isolation of that.
I actually wanted to ask you about burnout and neurodivergent, and then to explain that a little bit more. You have, but I touched on it, but then you've even talked about skill regression and burnout. But what I'm hearing is the burnout for the parent as well as the young adult?
It's for both. It might happen at different times. And that's why, I really encourage people, especially when they have young children that just get an identification, to start investing in themselves. But it feels impossible. I know that, but it's so important because you're in a marathon now and you need all your resources. And yeah, I think, the healthcare system that we have, the education system, those systems aren't really serving neurodivergent kids very well at the moment. And the parent who is invested emotionally in their child, wanting to be well, wanting them to be well supported, and then seeing how broken sometimes systems are, or working in systems that are not very helpful, it's exhausting. Then there's also the family system, right? If you have in our household, we had 3 very different individuals needing very different things at very different times. So, I joke about it being like whack-a-mole, like we're always, but you might also have a family system where you have a neurotypical sibling who's just feeling lost,
right,
because of all the need. And a parent, we know that, but we're doing the best we can. And so the level of emotional outpouring is a lot. And then you factor in isolation in some ways. You really, we need external supports.
I understand.
So,
So, but give me an example, if you can, about skill regression.
yeah, skill regression. In burnout, what happens is the nervous system collapses into where everything feels like a threat. And so it's like a turtle, everything pulls back in and retracts. So someone who may have been cruising along just fine, managing very complicated things, a job, a family, but they're also neurodivergent. Eventually, what can happen if you're not taking good care is that there'll be one thing too many. And now all of a sudden, the nervous system, which is tolerated, moves into shutdown. And when it moves into shutdown, it's just protecting vital resources. So the skill regression might be that it's suddenly someone's no longer able to keep up with the skills of independent living, like, feeding themselves appropriately, managing their money well, keeping their environment or clean, or even their own hygiene. They're just in survival mode. And I would say that divergent people, especially autistic folk, can have that happen sometimes. So if you're parenting someone and they're moving into a burnout, it's not because of a moral failing. I think it's just really important to recognize that their system has just tipped into overload. And the way out is support, not pep talks, not ultimatums or threats. It is, I see that you are not safe inside yourself. And how are we going to just help your nervous system heal? So it is a time for a parent to where we might see a regression, and we actually do need to step back in and be prepared to support. Or if we can't do that, we have to be able to also outsource some of that. So
Okay.
that might look like a therapist, might look like a medication review with the psychiatrist. It might look like some counseling, especially with someone who is up to date on neurodivergent brains and thinking. It could be an addictions coach, or a life skill coach when they're
Right.
ready to participate. They have to still summon enough energy. They have to have enough time in that safety zone to be like the turtle, ready to just poke their head out enough for help to come in.
Got it. And you're first of all, I feel like we're on like one step, like we're one step behind each other, or ahead of each other.
Oh,
I wanted to talk about outsourcing support. So is that though that would be an instance where you would, I mean, other than outsourcing support because you need it, for your own self-preservation and your own self-regulation, you need outside support. But is it also during a crisis when you see that they're regressing or burning out, and that's when you go and get that support?
I think support, again, it's a lifelong difference. So I think a lot of, especially ADHD folk, they just tend to be pretty good at knowing what they're good at and what just takes a lot of energy. So
Mm.
even, like I look at my kids, for example, if you have ADHD and you are showing up at work and you're, getting groceries and managing your finances, but cleaning your house is just too much. Like that just takes too much effort. Like that's a great place to outsource if you can. So
Okay.
so it's like having services available to us that just help us lean into our strengths better. So like some great examples, and we have so many now, like it's amazing. It's like Hello Fresh or something like that, where it's a meal delivery, or ordering your groceries online and all you have to do is show up and pick them up, or pay for a grocery delivery once a week. It might be cleaning. It might be maybe you need to just take your shirts to the dry cleaners in order to have them laundered and pressed, and have a routine around that, because, managing them is just too much work, but
Mhm.
you're really great at your job. You're just not great at the back end of it.
Right.
There's so many like apps that are out there now, exchanges, even just body doubling, like saying if you have a roommate, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't bring myself to clean. Why don't we do it together? Let's just start together. And the fact that you're doing it together is actually just helps. So, from paying lots of money to paying no money, and anywhere in between. But I think it's important to not look at those services as total luxuries. They're actually allowing someone to show up in life as their best self.
It allows somebody to show up as their best self.
Yes.
I don't think I've ever heard that put so eloquently, so beautifully, that
Mm-hmm.
reaching out to support, and the support could be any of those things, is just, it's freeing.
Mm-hmm.
It's so freeing.
Yes.
Here's a hard truth that you shared with me. Not every neurodivergent young adult will be able to live independently.
Mm-hmm.
And for many families, that is scary and feels very uncertain. So, what concerns do you hear most from parents on that topic? And how can you speak to the needs of, in terms of, transitional, or I think it's called supported living options? Like
Mm-hmm.
what's out there? Or,
There's
yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
there's so little out there to serve this population. And I think parents are doing their best. And this is probably one of the biggest fears, especially if you are really offering a lot of support to your neurodivergent child, or not child, adult. So there's all kinds of concern around that. I think we need to do better as a society to recognize the unique skills and gifts in this population, because there's a subset that will, yeah, definitely be able to go out and launch and get jobs and do all of that. There's another subset of neurodivergent folks who will struggle to find ongoing work, or who might be earning below a living wage, but still contributing, still so important, contributing. But without living in a parent's home, they don't have a lot of choices. So that's where I really feel it's so important for us as a society to consider what kind of supported living arrangements that we can have, so that, everyone deserves the opportunity for independence, and assisted living can create that community, can fill in some of those gaps that parents are currently filling in when parents are unable to do that anymore. I think it's really terrifying to think that we may have health problems and still have somewhat dependent, adults living in our homes.
Right.
I'm thinking, of groups, small groups that have, taken, different neurodivergent groups, especially autistic travelers, to
Mm.
destinations. Another friend whose young adult child is traveling, they have Down syndrome, but there's like a group of Down syndrome folks that go off on vacation with some facilitators. So they're adults. They want to have experiences, they want to travel, they want to do things. And it's just, if the parent is the only person, it's just, I don't know, it doesn't feel very independent, right? We
Yeah.
need more opportunities like that. I know there's some camps for autistic young adults as well, where, it's community meal prep, and it's adventures, and, it's trying things like kayaking. And so, making those social connections, and mom and dad aren't there. So there's an opportunity to just, like, I think we're all restricted a little bit when our parents are hovering.
Yeah.
It's so nice to have those opportunities, but they're very rare. They're too
Yeah.
rare right now.
Unfortunate.
Mm-hmm.
So before we wrap up,
Mm-hmm.
what message would you want to share with parents who are, raising neurodivergent kids and are feeling overwhelmed? I mean, are there any final thoughts, suggestions, words of encouragement that you could, share with them?
I think the most important thing is to educate yourself. Learn as much as you can about neurodiversity and neurodivergence. Really dig into your particular kids' challenges and strengths, especially their strengths. So, learning information about
Mm.
everything really is helpful. And then finding a community, which is hard in the early days. I get it, because people are a little bit tired, not just a little bit tired, they're really tired. It's a lot. It's a lot. So find somebody, keep looking, because now I think social media has got some things that we can find. We can look for different resources where we can connect and feel seen. So community is important. Education of yourself is important. And then I think the last one is to seek your own support team. Your kid's going to have one, but look for yours, so whether that's therapists, coaches, other parents. So yeah, those three things. Learn as much as you can, look for other families living what you're living, and get yourself some help so that your nervous system stays healthy.
Yeah. You've clearly gained a tremendous amount of insight through your experiences. And the way now that you're using your knowledge to support other parents, because actually I think that, first of all, I deeply respect what you've done. And the fact that you've not just done it and are going through it, but that you are willing to help other parents. So you know that I'll be giving your information, leaving it in the show notes on how to contact you. There are so many parents that must be so exhausted, but the fact that you're there and you offer this support, I really hope that parents reach out to you, because I know I would in a heartbeat. I've loved talking to you. I hope we can maintain this friendship. I would love to keep finding out how the boys are doing. And more than anything, Anita, I think people should reach out to you because you are such a source of inspiration. So I will definitely encourage people to contact you, because why not have that support system? Why not take care of yourself and know that you are not alone in this?
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Anita.
I'm blushing a little. It wasn't a perfect journey, but I've learned from a lot of it, and I really wanted someone to talk to about it who had lived it before me, and so I'm really happy to turn around and say, I've been where you are. There's a way forward.
Love that. And on that note, I thank you.
Thank you again, Sherry.
I hope today's episode gave you valuable insights and actionable steps that will help you guide your young adult to launch successfully into adulthood. If you found this topic helpful, feel free to leave a comment and hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star review helps us reach more parents who are dealing with the same issues. And if there's something you want to ask me, I invite you to join Launch Advice, my weekly publication where I answer one question from parents just like you. It's free advice that will appear in your inbox probably when you need it the most. Just click Launch Advice in the show notes and don't forget to email me your confidential question. And remember, no one ever said parenting is easy, especially when you're raising an adult. Talk to you soon.